Hello, I'm Jared from Jared's Discord. Welcome to the pilot episode of my series, Getting Better at Yu-Gi-Oh! This is going to be a show where I just want to give you competitive tips to help you get into the regional level, or if you're starting out and playing the game, give you some advanced tips to help you win playing. So on this specific episode, we're going to be talking about card interactions. One of the most umbrella terms in the game that really kicks out the people that have just started playing from the veterans. So without any further ado, before the video starts, leave a like, maybe subscribe if you guys enjoy the video. Wait till the end, of course, but let's get this started. Now, before we talk about card interactions as a whole, you must understand, and this is going to be a running theme throughout the entire series, that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very, very, very confusing game. And especially some of the rulings they give seem to be contradictory to one another, and they seem to almost just take each card in a card ruling in a case-by-case situation. Usually. There are exceptions, of course, but generally they seem to have rulings that will contradict one another. So it's important to understand that when going into this, especially something so broad as this. I guess, for example, the card Mystical Space Typhoon is often lauded to be the great negation card of the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! However, in certain situations, very few, it actually does negate cards, such as Fire Formation Tenki. It doesn't really negate it, but it prevents the effect from resolving if you activate it. If you chain Mystical Space Typhoon immediately to Fire Formation Tenki's activation. Stuff like that. Of course, that does not mean learning every single card interaction in the game. You will go insane. You will be like Big Hat Loken in Dark Souls, learning all this shit. So, let's just take it in a small way. Of course, you're going to learn card interactions over time. That is just a natural progression. But, especially if you're just starting out, learn how the card interactions work with at least the meta staples like Ash Blossom, Infinite Impermanence, or Call by the Grave, and the card interactions in your own deck. It doesn't really matter what deck it is. We'll just use, for example, what's something random. Tin Dangles are a cool deck. Am I right? I'm right. That is a deck that is very slow, pretty, you could consider not very competitively viable, but it has things that will allow it to gain advantage over time. And if you play stuff like Book of Eclipse or stuff like that, you can garner specific effects off of that. Understanding how the interactions work with Tin Dangles, especially for a lower tier deck. For higher tier decks, they can get away with making a few misplays because the deck is stronger. But a lower tier deck, you really have to understand how these card interactions work in order to fight against these more competitive decks. I guess one specific tip I can give you would be learning the difference between cost and effect. This is important. Detaching an Exceed material is a cost to activate the effect. Discarding a card to draw a card is a cost to get that search. That is not an effect that can be negated. The cost is not the effect that may happen after the card is discarded. If it's a specific effect like Farfa, Battle Branch of the Burning Abyss, that could be negated, but the act of discarding it is not. Or the act of using Layer of Darkness to tribute a monster, like let's say you're playing Inferno as Layer of Darkness, you can tribute an opponent's monster. That is not a respondable action. That is just the cost to activate the effect of the Infernally banishing a monster out of your graveyard, or card out of your graveyard. This has become much, much more prevalent lately because of all these. There's 10,000 cards in the game now. You have to understand the difference between a cost and effect, because that's where the really specific nuances of the card interaction may happen. We'll just use the card Divine Knight Felgrand, for example, because that's a card that I used to play. It's not very relevant now, but back in the day it was pretty competitive. Basically, it has like a quick effect. Well, I think 13th player's turn. I'm not sure if it's specifically a quick effect. We'll just use it as a quick effect for this example. You can detach material and make it unaffected by card effects. Pretty good. However, if what you don't know is, and this will go into the sequel video of this, which I'll make the second episode with timing and chaining. You can, in response to that, before the effect resolves where it targets itself, you can activate something like Book of Eclipse or Book of Moon, flip it down, and then the effect goes off where it does not make it effect anymore because it's now a face down monster. Again, that's a very specific example, but that's what card interaction is. You have to understand how these specific cards may interact with very other specific cards. And that's what this game is. So it's better to have the knowledge and not need to use it than to need to use it and not have the knowledge, if you get what I'm saying. To go along with this, it's important to understand what your cards can do to other cards. For example, do you know you can Solemn Warning Macrocosmos? Because it's a trap card that involves special summoning a monster. Even if they don't special summon it, you can still Macrocosmo it and get it out of the way. Stuff like that. You would never know that. Well, I won't say you would never know that, but you would never think of that interaction happening. But yes, that is how it works. So it's important to understand these very specific interactions. And I guess it's just like an umbrella thing to center it down again. Keep up with the rulings for these cards on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Database. For a variety of reasons. I know usually like on games like EDO Pro and YGO Pro, it keeps it automated. But if you're going in a regionals or a competitive tournament or just doing someone across the table, if you do not know how these cards work in response to your own, you can really hurt yourself. Like Called by the Grave, for example, it works until the end of your next turn. If you don't know that and your opponent knows that but is not going to say it, they can cheat out a win that way. I remember one of my first tournaments, I was playing Grails against Gravekeepers. This was for the Necrovalley errata. I could have brought my Grails back, but I did not know that, so I lost that game because I did not know how the Necrovalley interacted with Grails. Perfect example, actually. I guess the TLDR version is, keep up with at least learn the interactions of your own deck and the cards around the metagame at Staples, because if you don't, it will put you at an even bigger disadvantage if you are playing a lower tier deck against a higher tier deck. Which, I mean, if you're starting to play competitive, that's generally what happens. You do tend to play decks that you like rather than decks that are the best, because that's what you've gotten to the game with. So understanding these very specific card interactions can lead you into a victory just because you have more knowledge of the game rather than your opponent. So that is my first episode of Getting Better at Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I know this episode was pretty rough because it is my first episode. If you guys have any tips or ideas for future episodes, put it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear them. Anyway, I'm Jared from Jared Just Score, and I hope to see you guys again at Getting Better at Yu-Gi-Oh!